Isn't international law dead? What are you going to teach?
I can't recall how often I've been asked this question of, oh, do you still have a subject?
The present seems to be a present where beyond saying international law is dead, there's nothing more to do, or it's weakened and half alive.
I have real issues with those who are violating international law most also doing the declaration of death. It was a lovely walk. I think we're so blessed. I mean, these gardens are amazing. The frogs seem to be having a party because they're so happy that spring, I would say actually summer, has arrived. The garden is green, the sun is out, and we're in these amazing grotto, one of the most beautiful places of the EUI. Our researchers have just defended very impressive PhD theses, and the first years seem extremely enthusiastic about their new projects. So actually, with summer approaching, all seems really, really well.
It's not only seems, it is great. We saw flowers, green grass, and it's crazy to think that only a few months ago there were no flowers, it was raining, it was dark, it was cold. The grotto would have been very, very cold.
Damp.
And I think that contrast could be a nice metaphor to use for our own profession, because only a few months ago, you remember that we were asked many times, are you looking for a job? Isn't international law dead? What are you going to teach? So are we professors of a dead subject?
You're so right. I can't recall how often I've been asked this question of, oh, do you still have a subject? And of course, we have our standard responses, but what I actually think is interesting to look at, what triggers that question of, is international law dead? And I think from the layperson's perspective, that question was mostly triggered by the headlines in the newspapers. Violations of the prohibition on the use of force, invasion in Iran, invasion in Venezuela. Of course, a while ago already, but Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And of course, the headlines of the violations of international criminal law, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, Gaza, Sudan, the West Bank, Lebanon. It just seems to go on and on and on. So in that perspective, really, I do understand where the question comes from. But what is more interesting, I think, even is who is saying this about our own fields, within our community. And then I think international lawyers are used to violations of international law. The history is full of it. International law is not very good at enforcement. But there the question was more this attack on international law, or first of all, the withdrawal from it. So if we think about withdrawal from the UK's withdrawal from the EU, the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, it just seemed that international law was not so invoke. Withdrawal is, of course, perfectly, as you know, perfectly legal, or can be perfectly legal if it's done in the right way. But this sense of everybody... our field is not so popular in some ways. But perhaps the worst thing that it shocks our profession is the blatant attack on international law. And that's what we get when we see sanctions against judges of the International Criminal Court, or sanctions against Francesca Albanese, or like Russia convicting ICC judges in domestic criminal trials. And just to top it all off, a US president who says that his own morality trumps international law. So I do understand where all these questions are coming from.
Yeah, so you're recognizing the structural, let's say, weaknesses of international law, and that is one of the reasons international lawyers are invested or interested in this question of, is international law dead and alive? But now I'm intrigued, I have to confess, because you're not dressed all in black, you're colorfully dressed. I know that is spring, but you don't seem to be mourning international law.
Well, I think that if I had to adjust my dress code to the state of international law, I would never have worn a single color, because I encountered international law for the first time during my studies in the 1990s. And now we look back at that period as the heyday of international law. International institutions were growing, treaties were adopted. But I remember as a student mostly thinking, this is a field in crisis. And why? I mean, genocide, Rwanda. Then, as a Dutch person, I felt particularly co-responsible for what happened in Srebrenica, then the humanitarian intervention in Kosovo with this question of, is this a violation of international law? But also in the area of international economic law, it was certainly clear that more and more international economic law was not necessarily force for good, as we saw with the battle for Seattle, it depends, of course, what type of international economic law. So in that sense, I think international law has always been, or has said to be in a field of crisis. But what is interesting, I think, is that even though it was always in a set of crisis, the language of international law has always been used, and also today. There's so many people who go to the street to say that what is happening in Gaza, or what was happening in Gaza, amounted to a genocide. And the other part of the story is, of course, that on a day-to-day basis, international law, the ordinary international law, not this Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, but interstate cooperation is continuing for good or for bad. But it is, in some areas of international law, business as usual.
Yeah, that is very interesting that to emphasize, as you do, the good and bad. So when we interrogate is international law dead or alive, we take international law as being one big thing and not disaggregating between, let's say, international economic law, the everyday life of people who are subject to international law. What is remarkable is that we mentioned, we were asked, are you looking for another job? When neighbors or friends or family stopped asking and journalists stopped calling and the fancy op-eds in newspapers were no longer published, international lawyers very quickly went to business as usual. And I think it's our ability to find a comfortable space, let's say, in a type of eye of the hurricane.
And when you say our, do you mean you and I, or our profession?
Our profession, including, I'm blaming myself in that, because we're here teaching and continuing to produce international lawyers. So I'm happy to include myself in a practice of keeping the world is burning, keeping crises to the background, and so that we can actually talk about the last ruling of the ICJ, the next
International Court of Justice,
the International Court
ICJ.
of Justice, and the next negotiation on the law of the sea. And our friends here are staging a comeback. International economic law scholars are thinking, oh, the tariff saga will end at some point, maybe. It's a moment for the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to reemerge in glory. And what is interesting about this metaphor of the eye of the hurricane is not that the hurricane receded. So it's not that the crises of the moment went away, is that international lawyers managed to go back to business as usual. And maybe a bit depressing is that we have been so many times in this situation as a profession. And the profession has a myth of origin that has this cycle. So if we think about the origin of international law, it's either the colonial encounter, it's the religious wars, is Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II, Cold War. And each of those is followed by a foundational moment. It's Salamanca, is Grotius, and 1648 is the League of Nations, the United Nations, etc. So I think there is something to be said about what the next would be. So we're just waiting maybe for the next war, the next genocide. And we know that there is a well-rehearsed choreography. Some will say, international law is very, very, very dead. Others will be, no, it's alive. And then what is interesting, that we'll see the convergence into practice. So maybe the question is, what are we missing with this narrative?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we're missing a lot. And I think our colleague Hilary Charlesworth, who's of course currently a judge at the International Court of Justice, has warned for this. And she said, international lawyers are so good, they almost seem to thrive in a crisis. Give them a good crisis, because then they're the saviors of that situation. As a result, we are always kind of the surgeons, the legal surgeons of the dominant crises. But what about the everyday crises in people's lives and how international law is implicated in that? And perhaps that's what we should be looking at. And from that perspective, what I find interesting now is, who is doing the declaring of international law's death? If the people in Gaza were declaring international law dead, I would understand. If the women in Afghanistan did that, the people in Sudan, the people of the small island states who are being threatened by climate change, I would understand because international law seems to have failed them. But the opposite is true. First of all, they don't seem to be disillusioned by the fact that international law is violated because they're used to that. Secondly, they invoke it in the most creative way. They bring cases. They rally around the international institutions. And against that background, I have real issues with those who are violating international law most also doing the declaration of death, including the allies or the former allies like Mark Carney. And what do you think? Do you think that we're missing something, or am I missing something totally else that we should be missing?
No, so you mentioned Carney. It's like when I was mentioning World War I, World War II, Carney sounds like World War I or II in the sense that it was only a few months ago. And it already feels quaint because what we were talking, that the profession moves to the present. But what you were mentioning in being very careful on who is it declaring it dead or alive, it seems that those who are mostly affected are just invoking international law. The death or alive story is not relevant for them. And maybe in the profession, there's like a desire for reconstruction, and it's more about the profession rather than those who are a subject of the tragedies. And also, you mentioned Chatsworth, and before you also mentioned that as a Dutch, it was a genocide that was the crisis that inspired the article. And I think that one way of understanding the inability of international lawyers to not to go to crisis would be they didn't learn enough from the paper, which might be true, they didn't read it well. The other one is they read it, but it's almost inevitable because somehow we have to register what is happening in the world. Mm-hmm. And the temptation of crisis is almost impossible to avoid. And therefore, maybe one alternative would be assume it, international law is either dead or alive, and explore it deeply. So what I have in mind, for example, is that the present seems to be a present where beyond saying international law is dead, there's nothing more to do, or it's weakened and half alive. It's the only thing we can do. I'm thinking about what is happening now, let's say the succession from Venezuela to Cuba, the genocide in Gaza before, is that the ending point of international lawyers is invoking the violation or being very explicit that there was a violation of international law. All the letters stop there. But only a few years ago, if we think about Russia's aggression in Ukraine, that was not the ending point, it was the starting point. So there is a violation to international law, and then the idea was we can do all these other things, mm-hmm. from borrowing from climate change, and we have loss and damage, and then we should have a special court on aggression, and we're going to freeze assets and seize them, and then a doctrine to get around immunity. And I think all this, we're not exploring it in relation
in the context of, for instance, Iran.
In the context of Iran, and in the context of the US as being the violator of international law. For example, as you know, I'm from Chile, and to me, the Pinochet case is important because there was, for a long time, international lawyers and human rights lawyers design a strategy, knowing that most likely it will never actually happen. But the idea was that symbolically, it was very important for all dictators of the world, or all those who violate very important rules of international law in the world, that if they travel, they might get caught. And then someone travels, and then it happens. So it is like a long-term strategy that we're foreclosing. There is a World Cup in the US next year, and no one is thinking about the human rights strategies of truth, blaming, shaming, even if it's articulations of international law at the symbolic level, and then maybe at some point it would have an actual accountability consequence.
Yeah, there was this moment that there was the Pinochet effect, right, on leaders, and then it was held against Rumsfeld at the time. But we don't see much of that with respect to President Trump or his fellow ministers. It's true.
Do you see other ways of resisting or getting around the narrative of crisis?
Well, I also think that if we use the term crisis, let's then take it seriously. So if we look at the work done by political theorists, Wendy Brown, and also lawyer Sarah Kendall, they have taken that notion seriously and gone all the way back to the Greek origins, where crisis had an element of the polis working on itself and really inward reflection, okay, what is wrong with this? And I think if we took that seriously, this inward reflection, but then also judgment and repair, those notions are essential to the work crisis, then we can actually use it productively to work on a different international law. An international law, for instance, that does much more about the unjustifiable inequality in the world. And maybe that's the bigger crisis than yet another violation of Article 2.4. What about you? What do you think? Where should we be putting our energies?
I have an answer. So going back to the idea of crisis and doing something with it, I think that today there's, as we have talked, there's a very important problem in the basic structure of international law, and that basic structure is in the Charter. And
the UN Charter.
The UN Charter, which is like the world's constitution, and it's at the foundation of the United Nations, but also the foundation, fundamental rules of the system. And the international community or international lawyers have been talking about reform forever. And I'm going to publish soon a short book called Deceiving the Hopes of Humanity, Withdrawing from the United Nations. And the idea is not to kill the UN, but through a doctrinal analysis, to develop tactics to reimagine world order and change the Charter. So I think this goes back to the idea that maybe there are other ways to work on crisis rather than declaring international law dead or alive, and imagining different futures.
So here you use the threat of withdrawal as a strategy to reform the UN. Perhaps
and
that's
the fundamental rules of the system.
I think that's what David Cameron tried to do with Brexit, but then he actually ended up withdrawing.
This is for realizing, rather than contesting, the aspirations of, in this case, 45 is to realize the aspirations of peace, security, and well-being.
So that's what the first part of the title refers to, right?
So Deceiving the Hopes of Humanity is a quote from the proceedings of San Francisco.
So if the UN deceives the hope of humanity, then states then we should leave. The peoples should leave.
Yeah, because as you know, the UN Charter says we, the people of the United Nations, not we, the states. So it is for the peoples to reclaim that project.
But here you have a withdrawal strategy as a way of reimagining the world. Do you also have things of reimagining the world without withdrawing from something?
Yeah, so we're in the Grota. The summer school in a few weeks, as you know, will happen here in the Grota. And the topic of the summer school is reimagining planetary order. As we were walking, we were saying, it's so warm for being
this time of year.
This time of the year. So the idea there is to work on the idea of the climate crisis and how to reimagine order that would not just be anthropocentric, but if we think about non-human beings as part of a planetary arrangement, how would that international planetary order look like?
Well, by the sounds of it, we've got a lot of work to do. There's a lot of reorganizing.
Let's go back to work.
Because I don't think we are the professors of a dead subject. Our subject seems to be very much alive and kicking.